Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Human Health and the Planet's Health session. I hope you all enjoyed the plenary. It was certainly innovative and inspiring. My name is Juli Trtanj. I'm with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and I'm actually really excited to be moderating this amazing group of speakers we have for you this afternoon. The order is what you see in your agenda here, but just a couple logistical things. We are being live streamed, so the audience will be able to hear you but not ask questions, so the questions are still in the room. And I wanted to just sort of get us started on the same page while people are filtering in. I know the opening plenary went a little bit long, but you guys are all here now on time, and so we're going to go ahead and start. Human health and the planet's health. And why am I actually excited to be here? So this is a picture of an ocean. It looks like a planet to me. And we're all sort of very connected. I'm very much thrilled to have the opportunity to work for the agency I do. We're the guys who do the observation of oceans and atmosphere and land, and we're the prediction folks. We protect the marine species. We manage or try to manage their health. They pretty much manage themselves, and we think we're managing fisheries, but you know how that goes. We manage fishermen, and they manage themselves too. The most creative people in the world, I think, are probably fishermen. I used to do fisheries work, so you put a fisheries regulation out about the length of a boat, and then the boats become wider. It's very interesting. So, so we protect whales. We've got fisheries regulations as well, but we also have an environmental stewardship mission. So we get to do everything from the deep sea to the sky to in between. This is a ice cap in an iceberg in Glacier Bay. So we have the panoply of lower sea to upper atmosphere and managing some of the resources in between. We have an environmental conservation mission, and we're the people that get to predict stuff. So this map here is a really, you could give a whole talk, but one of the cool things about being on the data side of this is that we actually do observe a lot of this information, and it's how we're able to track some of these trends and indicators and things over time that are relevant to our health and well-being, and that allow us to predict things that will help us prepare and plan and reduce the impact of our footprint on the planet. I want to raise an issue here, though. The reason I put this observing system slide up here is this is a network of ocean-going vessels, deep-sea vessels from our ocean exploration program, buoys that are moored in the ocean, that are on our coastal systems, and this is a network of institutions around the world that observe our ocean, and there's a similar system for the atmosphere. It's even more complex. But what it allows us to do is predict. Like I said, I'm in the prediction agency, so we get to observe and predict stuff. So this is all very good. The topic here is human health and the planet's health. So I'm going to take an infectious disease example here, and we're going to hear more about this in the panel. But if you talk about how things currently work with an infectious disease outbreak, this is a generalized infectious disease curve, right? And there's an opportunity to control only a little bit of that, and that did not transfer well. I didn't check my own slides. So you have an opportunity from the first case of something, whether it's a disease in a zoonotic environment or whether it's an influenza strain, you have opportunity to control sort of at the end of a response. But if you were to able to move that bar forward using our observational systems and our prediction systems and our understanding of how we interact with the environment, and our ability to do something about that, you'd have the opportunity to really control a disease outbreak or some sort of health outcome before it even gets going. So then you have the other problem of, well, how do you monitor that? How do you know you're having an effect if there's not actually a problem to document? But that's a problem I think we could actually have. So if you think about why we're all doing this, most scientists are obviously scientifically inclined, right? You have an inquisitive mind. But there's also a piece of this that is about changing values. So if we monitor and observe and predict everything, that's great. But if nobody does anything, why are we still surprised by Ebola and by Zika and by some of these outbreaks when we can actually observe? Why are we having problems with our food supply when we actually understand what's happening in the shifts in our fisheries and our fish species? Why are we still surprised by those things? What do we value about our systems? Why are we actually facing still some pretty serious environmental problems when we actually understand them a lot better than we did 20 years ago? So the reason that I set this tone is because we're going to hear from some speakers who have very innovative solutions. So I sit in an agency that does the observations and the solutions and the prediction part. But what we do about it is beyond any one of us, but also resides within each one of us. So we're going to hear examples from luminaries in the field on how they have approached the science problems, the connection to the environment, and what we can actually do about it. So this whole summit is called the Earth Optimism Summit. So these are very positive, powerful people on this panel here who've made a really significant change in what they're doing. So I'm going to introduce them one by one and let them give you an overview of what they're bringing to this equation and their interpretation of science values and maybe where we're going in the future. And then we'll have a bit of a time for dialogue and questions collectively at the end. But since this is live streamed, we're going to go ahead and ask 1 or 2 questions after each speaker. But I'm going to be pretty tight on that because we want to make sure we don't run out of time at the end. So sorry for the order here. It's a little different than what you have in your agenda, but we're going to start with Drew Harvell. She is an ocean health expert at Cornell University. She's been at this for quite a long time. I've had the pleasure of working with her on a grant or 2. And also she's published a book on beluga glass, sea glass, which I believe is going to be highlighted tomorrow. Is that the book tomorrow? Mm-hmm. So Drew, why don't you come on up and see if we, I'm gonna leave you with this one. There we go. Believe this should work fine. Okay.
Great.
All right.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you all for coming. Look at the room's full. This is fantastic. I'm really delighted that I didn't think anybody could find this place. So what I'm going to talk about today are healthy seas. And let's think about this. Let's just think about what healthy seas could do for us. What if I showed you how investing in the ocean could improve human health on land as well as near the sea, improve seafood safety for human consumption, increase algal farming yield, increase biodiversity and ecosystem stability? I'm really hoping you'd really want to invest in that you'd think that would be great, especially if we could use the natural capital that we find in our ecosystems, the ecosystem services. And this is a paper we published a couple of months ago showing that seagrass ecosystems reduce exposure to bacterial pathogens of humans, fishes, and invertebrates. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that story, about how the oceans improve human and environmental health. First, I'm going to have to tell you the slightly bad news. This is my world where under warming conditions, diseases are on the rise, whether it's our living ocean biota or whether it's humans on land. A warmer world, in fact, ends up often being a sicker world. But the good news that I'm going to talk about is that coastal seagrasses decrease pathogenic bacteria from human sewage by 50%. It doesn't cost us anything. It's a natural ecosystem service. Furthermore, coastal seagrass beds can also improve biodiversity by decreasing diseases of foundation coral species. So again, welcome to my world. One of the things we've been doing over the last couple of decades is just trying to stem a rising tide of ocean disease outbreaks, and we're getting really tired of just monitoring and studying death and destruction. We're very interested to try to find better ways forward to produce healthier ecosystems, whether it's of lobster, fish, corals, or marine mammals. So I lead a group that studies was studying health of coral reefs on Barang Lompo Island in Indonesia. And this is what that island looks like. So we went to this island in Sulawesi because it's the center of coral and actually all of marine biodiversity, so very biodiverse ecosystems, and also intense human use of those ecosystems. And you know, when you look at this, it kind of looks like a tropical paradise. There's a very lovely village, nearby beaches, vibrant coral reefs. When you get a little bit closer, though, the story's a little bit different. Although Indonesia is the heart of marine biodiversity, human health and environmental health are linked. And what happened to us is we got sick while leading this workshop on this sort of remote tropical island. All of us. I led an international team there. We had to send our Australian scientist home because she had typhoid and it took her 2 months to recover from that. The rest of us got amoebic dysentery. And I thought, you know, this is ironic that the coral health team or coral disease team also all got sick. And it kind of really sort of stuck the thought in my mind that, wow, human health and environmental health are linked. And so we said, well, geez, we got to find out what's in this water. Not only for the corals, but also for people. And so this comes from that paper that we published, and it's a list of the sequence using the DNA sequences of all of the bacteria that are in that water. And in addition to quite a few fish and invertebrate pathogens, bacteria that make those animals sick, the things with the arrows are stuff that makes humans sick. So Clostridium, Enterococcus, Shigella, and Streptococcus, among other things. And so that water is kind of dangerous. So it's no wonder we got sick. But here's the interesting thing. If you take and measure Enterococcus bacteria, and this is the standard EPA standard for how we decide if our water is safe to swim in. If it has a certain level of Enterococcus, it's not safe, and I can tell you right now, the one on the left is not safe. The bottom one on the right's not even safe. What we found is that places where there was no seagrass had much higher titers of these Enterococcus bacteria than places where we had seagrass meadows. And so as part of a project that we were doing to study ecosystem services, we said, hey, what if we measure the filtration service of our seagrass beds? And so what you see here is the mean Enterococcus levels along a gradient there from the shore. It's really high right near the shore. It's very dangerous there. As you get out to the seagrass bed, you can see that green line's dropping much faster. So that's that filtration service of the seagrass bed, diminishing the Enterococcus bacteria, and even lower as you get out to the reef. So this was kind of the essential quantification of this service. So we were really pleased that it was so dramatic, over a 50% reduction. And my postdoc, Juli then went on to do, with a colleague, the complete bacterial sequencing of all of the bacteria that were on this. And then again, I just want to show you some of the data. Again, you can see on the left that those are the 4 islands. This is well replicated, 4 different islands, complete gradients run, thousands of samples done, where seagrasses are absent and seagrasses are present. Again, on the seagrasses present, you can see a huge drop as you get into that seagrass bed. And then it's sort of really interesting. As scientists, we kind of do like to look at this. You can see all the individual bacteria and how those change in the different environments. So again, if you look at the right panels, you can see very dark blue at the shore. That's where all the, for example, the first one's Shigella bacterium, and then it diminishes very sharply in the seagrass flat, and then even more out to the reef. So this is the good science that's needed to support our hypothesis that seagrass beds can essentially filter or diminish bacteria in the water. Not just bacteria, also diseases of corals are lower near seagrass beds. So this is the evidence that there's also a boon to the environment of living in or near a seagrass bed. So these are diseases of corals, and you can see the black bars are the levels of coral disease, the percentage of corals that have black band or white syndrome. The first 2 are the big difference there. Outside seagrass beds and inside seagrass beds, it's more than a half diminish. So of course, the million-dollar question is, what's a seagrass bed doing? And that's not something that we were set up to study in this particular study, but it's something that we're moving on towards trying to understand. There's probably 3 different mechanisms for how a seagrass bed is diminishing levels of bacteria, but I just want to talk about one, because in a way it's the most obvious. Because the other thing about seagrass beds are that they provide habitat. There's other things that live in a seagrass bed, things like bivalves, like on this picture here. Both of these aquaria contain 400,000 algal cells. However, the aquarium on the right is stocked with 24 marine clams. And over the course of about an hour, you're going to see a big change, if I can get this to work. There it goes. The clock is ticking. Watch the one on the right. You're going to see it's a very, simple demonstration, but this is how natural filtration works in our ocean ecosystems. So we think that one of the mechanisms in the seagrass beds is that there are clams and sponges and other organisms that are just basically sucking the bacteria out of the water. The oxygenation is also very important that seagrass provide. So that's international work. We're also working domestically. This is actually the largest seagrass bed in the continental U.S. This is one of our study sites in the Pacific Northwest in Washington State. And we're going to be studying some of the processes of natural filtration in these kinds of beds. But we're also studying this problem. There are things that seagrass beds can't filter out. So this is actually a disease of the seagrass bed, and we're interested in finding ways to diminish this problem that's kind of eating away at our natural frontiers. So just to sum up, why does seagrass hygiene matter? We've talked about safer recreation and healthier people, and I think the costs, if you consider the costs of some of the diseases that people are getting from poor hygiene, it's not just in countries like Indonesia. For example, in Seattle just this spring there were enormous overflows of the septic system. Similarly, in communities we work in Hawaii, same thing. There's always overflows of the septic systems, and that's a vital role that our natural ecosystems can play in cleaning the water. Safer seafood, greater biodiversity, and then one of the projects that we haven't published yet but we have data on is that diseases of cultured algae are also lower in seagrass beds. So the reason I like to emphasize this, and I think we can call it new optimism for seagrass ecosystem services, is this hasn't actually, although we've known for many, many years that coastal wetlands can pull nutrients out of the water and do a lot of cleaning up of toxic substances, the actual role in human health has not been investigated. And I'm hoping that this will provide more incentives, more natural capital benefits for preserving these ecosystems. And of course, we can add this to the long list of ecosystem services that we already know about and in fact was already mentioned in terms of the blue carbon sink. And then just sort of one positive example of uptake, Puget Sound's vital signs. You can't see them all, but there's one there that talks about eelgrass, and the goal is to increase eelgrass beds by 20%. So that's my hope. These kinds of studies can lead to that sort of uptake. I want to thank my collaborators. A lot of the work was done actually by Juli, our postdoc, who was funded by the Nature Conservancy as well as our Atkinson Center, and another postdoc. Oh, I think we're almost done. And the only other thing I want to make is a brief commercial break, which is that not only do I study diseases, but I'm also interested in how ocean biodiversity make people happy and the intersection of art and nature. So I have a book out this year that I'll talk about in the author group tomorrow, and we have a film that's being shown tomorrow night. So I'm happy if there's time for a question. One quick question, I think. Yeah.
How easy is it to reestablish seagrass beds in places that may have lost it?
Well, there are a lot of extensive seagrass restoration efforts. My plug would be, let's just try really hard to not lose them, because it's a whole lot easier to not lose them. But there's actually very good technology for reestablishing seagrass beds. And again, I think if we had better financing of it, we could really do quite a job to put some back. Thanks for that question. And thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Drew. Encouraging. Our next speaker is Anne Tutwiler. She is the Director General for Biodiversity International, and she comes to us from a long history of work in the Food and Agricultural Organization, also with our U.S. Department of Agriculture and USAID, and she's going to bring with her a bit of a perspective from a food and a food introduction perspective. So I believe that we've got you up. Please come on up. There you go.
So thank you very much, and I'm glad to see also the room is full. I had my doubts when I was finding my way here. So what I want to talk to you about today is essentially how we can reintroduce some of the crops that have been lost over time back into our diets. So first of all, let me explain about Bioversity International and what actually agricultural biodiversity is. So Bioversity International is an international research for development organization. We're based in Rome. We do our work in developing countries, primarily Africa and Asia. What I want to talk, and so let me just say what ag biodiversity is. So agricultural biodiversity is everything that we use to produce food. It is all the species, it is all the varieties of crops, fruits, vegetables, animals, fish, including the soil bacteria, including worms, including pollinators. So it is the whole panoply of biodiversity that goes into how we produce our food. My organization works primarily on plants, so that will be my focus. So what I want to talk about is how we were able to help reintroduce millet into India. Now, for those of you who don't know, millet is a traditional grain. It's very resilient, it's very nutritious, and it was a grain that had fallen out of favor in India after the Green Revolution and the introduction of rice and wheat, high-performing rice and wheat varieties. So first of all, I would like to talk about the challenges that we are facing globally, where we think agricultural biodiversity can play an important role. So the first challenge, and this is always surprising to people, this is a report by the World Health Organization. Poor diets are the world's #1 health risk, more than tobacco, alcohol, and drug use and unsafe sex combined. Okay, just let that sink in for a minute. So the food we eat is the source of major health problems, both in terms of obesity and non-communicable diseases, but also maternal health, child health, stunting, that is causing problems primarily in the developing world. Secondly, we all, most of us, understand that farmers will be facing novel climates in the future. Now, I like to show this slide rather than the slides that talk about yield loss, because what this says is that everywhere you see red and everywhere you see orange, these are areas where farmers are not going to be able to grow the same crops that they're growing now. They may have to grow different varieties, they may have to grow different species. And you'll notice that this is not just in the developing world. We see farmers in the United States, in the Midwest, farmers in the southern part of Europe and the Mediterranean, and Central Asia, all facing new climates that they're going to have to adapt and adopt new crops, new varieties. So the third, and this is another maybe surprising statistic for people who don't live in the world of food and agriculture, 3 crops, rice, maize, and wheat, provide more than half of the world's plant-based calories. 3 crops. And unfortunately, it's an ever-diminishing variety within those crops as well. So we are heavily reliant on these 3 crops, and if you go beyond these 3 and include 12 crops and 5 animal species, they provide 75% of the world's total. Now, this is in a world where Kew Gardens recently reported that there are 5,500 different crops that have been grown or harvested for food over the history of the data that they have. Now, that means we are not using all of that agricultural biodiversity to help us deal with these challenges of nutrition, resilience, and diversification of our food supply. So we began to work in India to try to reintroduce millets into the farming system there. Now, just to give you a little bit of data here. So there are a number of different kinds of millets, and they each have their own nutritional profile. So 100 grams of cooked finger millet has 38 times the amount of calcium as 100 grams of rice. 100 grams of little millet, which you also see pictured there, has more than 9 times the amount of iron as white rice. So these are crops that should be reintroduced into a country that has high levels of micronutrient deficiency, and still, despite India's progress, high levels of stunting, childhood stunting, which for those of you who don't follow this contributes not only to greater problems with disease, but also affects cognitive abilities. So this affects people's long-term ability to learn, long-term ability to earn income. So I'm going to talk about the steps that we used with a number of partners, of course. We never work alone, to reintroduce millet. And I'll just say that this is an example in India, but our organization has done similar work on quinoa in the Andes, and we all know what quinoa has become, with leafy green vegetables in Africa and other tropical fruits in other parts of the world. So the first thing is millet takes a lot of effort to grow, right? So farmers have been reluctant to grow it, especially when they have these varieties of rice and wheat that are slightly easier to grow. So one of the first pieces of work that we did was to work with farmers to develop new harvesting and drying techniques that reduce the amount of time and the amount of drudgery that were involved in actually producing this crop. The second thing, of course, farmers need seeds, and they need access to good seeds, high-quality seeds that will perform and give them good yields. So we worked again with partners to provide 10 tons of high-quality seed of improved varieties, which means they were bred for improved traits, of 5 minor millet species. We transferred these to seed banks in a number of villages in India, and as you can see there, most of these seed banks are run by women. These seed banks were then able to distribute this grain out to farmers who wanted to produce it. So it's great. We've got the farmers willing to produce, we've got the seeds, but somebody's got to eat. So the next thing we did was work with chefs. We worked with small enterprises in India to develop products from millet. And again, remember that we are reintroducing these crops to people who haven't eaten this food for a long time. So you have to find ways to make it sexier, make it more interesting. So we worked with all of these different constituencies to make this palatable, to make millet interesting. Just a side note, in Kenya, when we were reintroducing African leafy green vegetables, very high in nutrients, we actually worked with the Parliament of Kenya to start serving these traditional African leafy green vegetables in the Houses of Parliament. Again, raising the profile, raising the status of these foods. So we had 3 target groups of consumers. So first are urban consumers, a lot like probably most of us in this room. So again, we worked with chefs and others who are marketing to those of us who want to go to a restaurant and try new things, try different varieties, experience new tastes. And this is important because, as I said, a lot of times in developing countries, these sort of lost crops tend to have an image of, oh, that's what my grandmother used to eat. You know, we don't eat that anymore. I mean, I grew up, you know, my grandmother liked kale. Who knew? You know, I thought, oh, that's really nasty stuff. So you have to change the image, and you can change the image in large part by helping urban consumers change their views of the crops that their grandparents might have produced back in the village. So, but we also have to change the dietary habits of people living in the villages, because those are the people who suffer the most from these micronutrient deficiencies and from stunting. So one of the other challenges with millet is actually quite difficult to mill. And we introduced these so-called mini mills, which you can see the woman is working at on the right-hand side of the screen there. So before the introduction of these mini mills, it took women 2 hours to mill these millets. Now, with this device, 10 minutes. The last consumer group we worry about is children. So we have, again, worked with school feeding programs to reintroduce millet into school lunches. Now, you know students are the toughest audience ever. 85% of the children in the pilot scheme actually liked these millet-based meals and ate them, didn't dump them in the trash can. So we also saw similar statistics of women introducing millets back into their families' diets. Second to the last slide. So finally, and this was the big coup, this was the big result. We worked with a number of local organizations, including Dr. Swaminathan, who was well known in India for introducing the Green Revolution, to convince the national government to reintroduce millets into their food security scheme. So this was actually then creating a market and creating incentives for people to be able to buy this nutritious, resilient food. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take a couple of questions if we have time. Sure.
How much is this initiative directed towards subsistence, and how much of it is directed toward actually obtaining revenue from this product?
So most of the people that we were working with in the rural communities were, sort of on the edge of subsistence farming, moving, I think, into more productive areas. But if you don't create the market, people will not produce the food, you know? And there has to be income coming back to the farmers in terms of demand, in terms of incentive structures. So, we try to work at both ends, ensuring that we're creating incentives for the farmers, but also creating a value chain, a market chain, to incentivize the production of these foods.
Along with the producing a market for the millet, is there also now a market for the grinder? People in the
Yes.
marketplace aren't going to want to do
Yeah,
the grinder.
So the question is there a market for these grinders? So one thing that's interesting I didn't point out is by introducing these mini mills into the system, it's enabled women to create sort of micro enterprises around these mini mills. So we're seeing them increasingly be adopted by women because, I mean, 2 hours versus 10 minutes is pretty compelling. So, yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that really interesting presentation. And I can't help but comment on the knock-on effects of all of this for, communities, and your question about the, other benefits that spin off of this is pretty amazing. All right, so our next speaker is Dr. Henry Webb. She comes to us from, she's a founder of Health in Harmony, and started her path, as I know it anyway, with orangutans in Borneo, and was inspired by some of the problems she saw there, went back and got her medical degree at Yale, and then is now back going to talk to us about how she is working with native populations to protect the environment and their health. So, Dr. Webb, please come on up here. There we go.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here today. So, when I was 21 years old, I had the amazing opportunity to spend a year deep in the rainforest of Borneo studying orangutans. It was said at that time that an orangutan could go from coast to coast on the third largest island in the world without touching the ground. And looking out on that view, you could believe it. But that was before Borneo went through the fastest rate of deforestation the world has ever known. And yet still, even back then, you could hear that hated sound, the sound of a chainsaw in the distance. And I knew what would follow because the trees they were cutting were so enormous that when they hit the ground, you could literally feel the earth shake in your feet. And I began to wonder if it would make any difference to discover that orangutans were critical for the maintenance of all that amazing biodiversity in the forest, if they were extinct. It was easy to hate those loggers and assume that they were evil people. But the truth of the matter is, I had gotten to know many of those men, and they were in an impossible situation. Imagine for a moment that you had a child as beautiful as one of these. Wouldn't you do anything for them? But if you are a subsistence agriculturalist and you're growing only a little bit more rice than you need to feed your family and make a little bit of money, then one medical emergency, which can cost an entire's income, will just devastate you. And sadly, one of the only ways to get enough cash to pay for something like that is to illegally log within the national park. One man I know, Pak Sofian, cut down 60 trees to pay for one C-section. And I'm not talking trees, right? I'm talking trees that are host to unbelievable biodiversity. Now, eventually those trees are worth lots of money on the market, but the man who cuts them may get tens to a few $100s per tree. And the thing is, Pak Sofian understands how important the forest is for his well-being. In fact, he calls the forest his mother, like many of the people around the park. We did a baseline survey, and 99% of the people wanted to protect the forest. They see a direct connection between the health of the forest and the health of their family. The water comes down from the hills, it feeds the rice fields then feed their family. They also have a cultural understanding that with logging comes more disease, and there's data to show there's a higher rate of malaria in logged versus unlogged forest. So I began to wonder, maybe the best way to save orangutans was actually with one of these. So I went back to medical school and I did my training in family medicine before returning to Indonesia to do a combined health and conservation program. So in the first year, I founded a nonprofit called Health in Harmony, and then I spent a year traveling across the country looking for the best place for this program. I ended up back where I started at Gunung Palong National Park, although there were many other potential good options. And I teamed up with this woman, Hotlan Ampasunggu, and the two of us founded an Indonesian nonprofit called Alam Sehat Lestari, and we began work with the approximately 100,000 people surrounding Gunung Palong National Park. So how are we going to stop the logging? Well, the question is, do I know? to how to figure out how to stop this rampant illegal logging, I was very well educated. But actually, that was a problem because I had been taught to think in boxes. And that isn't the way it works. It's more like this. The problems are tightly intertwined. And the people who understand this exactly are the people who live around the park. So we spent 400 hours in our first year just listening to communities, to all the villages around the park. And we said, you all are guardians of a precious rainforest that is valuable to the whole world. What would you all want as a thank you for protecting it? Well, I call this process radical listening. Why do I call it radical? 1, because we do it with radical love and respect. 2, because it's actually bottom-up driven change. And 3, because we really did what people said. So what did they say? First, they said, we cannot protect the forest without access to high-quality, affordable health care. And then they said we need training in organic farming. I was really surprised by the second point, but this is what they said. The traditional form of agriculture is slash and burn. That works really well when there's lots of forest and not many people. And it doesn't work for us anymore. And we heard there was a way to plant in one place without expensive chemical fertilizers, and we don't know what it is. Would you please teach us? Well, Hotland, she's a dentist, I'm a doctor, we didn't actually know that much about organic farming. But I like to joke that what is needed in one place in the world is excess in another. So it was actually relatively easily on the next door island of Java. There is a many thousand-year tradition of sustainable agriculture, and it was quite easy for us to bring over trainers who then have completely transformed the agriculture in our communities. So that's how we do high-quality healthcare. That's how we do sustainable livelihoods. How do we provide high-quality healthcare in an area of the world where it's still developing? Well, in the United States and in much of the developed world, there is actually an excess of physicians who have lots of resources, but actually are often lacking in meaning. So we have these physicians from around the globe, and they come and they give thousands of hours of free training to our young Indonesian doctors. The doctor on the right, Dr. Noor, we actually sent him to Yale and Stanford for further training. He received a lectureship at Yale, and he's now doing his internal medicine residency in Indonesia. And when he finishes, he will be the head of our hospital, our new hospital that we have built. These are amazing physicians. They just needed access to the right training. So that's how we do high quality. How do we do affordable? Well, in our clinic, you can pay with all kinds of non-cash means. You can pay with seedlings that we use for reforestation. You can pay with beautiful traditional handicrafts that we then sell to pay for medicine, or you can pay with manure that we use in the organic farming training. People think it's very funny. You can pay with poop for medicine. And in addition, to further promote conservation, villages that are not doing any logging get a 70% discount on their health care, paid for by organizations that care about conservation. In this way, men like Pak Sofyan never have to log to pay for health care. So what is the impact to the work that we have done? Well, in the first 5 years, the number of infant deaths per 100 households declined from 3.4 to 1.1. And many other measures of health also dramatically declined in just the first 5 years. And then how are we doing in terms of logging? Well, when we first started, there were an estimated 1,350 logging households. After 5 years, that went down to 450, and now we're at about 180 individuals. This really works. And what are those previous loggers doing? Well, 52% are farming. They were exactly right when they told us what they needed for an alternative livelihood. Radical listening works. So what is the effect of doing one site? Well, around our national park, we saved we helped save about 2,000 orangutans. It's a very large population and very important population because they have babies every 8 years. And then if that entire forest were to be logged and burned, which is usually what happens when there's logging, the amount of carbon released would be equivalent to 14 years of San Francisco pollution. These forests are incredibly important to protect, not just for the communities there, but for all of our well-being all over the planet. But there's another thing. What you do may not be as important as how you do it. Empowerment really matters. This is a picture of some of the 106 employees that we now have in Indonesian Borneo. And I have now passed on the leadership to Dr. Monica Nirmala. One community member summed it up best when he said, "Before this program started, we had no hope, but now we know change is possible." So what Health and Harmony is working on now is evaluating sites during this year and hoping to choose a site in 2018 for our next few locations. Because there are many places where people do not have hope and where they are having to choose between their short-term and their long-term well-being. And that is a problem for our entire planet. Imagine what we could do if we matched community-determined solutions from all over the world with the excess resources and knowledge that are out there. Because no one should ever have to choose between the survival of their family members and the health of the environment, which gives us all health. The truth is, we don't have to choose between these two adorable little ones. The way to save baby orangutans is to save baby humans, and vice versa. True win-win solutions are possible. And the means of getting to planetary health may be right in front of our eyes, or I should say, right by our ears. We just have to listen. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions too. Yes, go ahead.
Hi there.
Hi.
My name is Simi. I'm from the Entrepreneurs Organization. This is a great presentation.
Oh, thank you for coming.
Learned a lot. No worries. So I had a question about how you get the word out at the local level and the role of the employees. Are they the ones in charge of, getting that word out about this initiative, great initiative?
Yeah, so getting the word out on a local level, we're pretty famous, and one of the reasons that we're so famous in that area, which is to say anywhere you go, any one of our staff members, we all also wear the same uniform, whether you're a driver, whether you're a forest guardian or a community health worker, whoever, we all wear the same uniforms, doctors. And so that kind of helps, and they always come up to us and they're so excited. And what they usually say to me when they come up to me is they say, "Dr. Kinari, we're so happy with this program because, when I designed it, I did a really good job." Because the thing is, they really feel like they own it. And they do own it. They did design it. And that has a totally different relationship. We aren't trying to impose something on them. It's something that came from the communities, and they say, "Hey, we really had the right solution, and it works." And as I say, there's 106 employees, only one non-Indonesian working for the team. Yeah.
Yes, I wanted to ask you how you deal with poachers from outside the community.
Yeah.
Black market. Clearly, people in the community have a vested interest in their future. This is an issue that we see in many situations where there's destruction of natural resources. It's an external source that is funded, and there's a black market connection.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious.
So the question is poachers and the black market. So it's actually pretty rare in our area, mostly because the communities are very good at protecting the sort of section of the park that they, so they don't let people in that they don't want to let through. However, there was a little bit of poaching quite a few years ago now, but there were some orangutans poached. And actually, one of the family members of the poacher, a woman, came to our clinic and told us about it. And she was in tears, and she said, "This, I know it's a family member, but this is not okay. Like, this just, this has to stop." And she gave us really good information, which we actually passed on to another organization that there is a representative of here, called Yayasan Palung, and they helped actually track down and gain evidence, which actually didn't get the person who did the poaching, but got the guy who was selling the meat, which was much more important. So yeah, it does work. And I think that providing healthcare provides a means of people being able to come, trust us. Yeah. Thank you very much.
The worst job of a moderator is having to cut off the conversation. So all really good talks, and I'm sure we could all ask more. We're going to move on now to hear from...
There's an extra slide.
Oh, sorry. Got it. I've done that too, actually. So we're going to hear from Beth Allgood from the International Fund for Animal Welfare. Her work is on, for IFAW, is more on wildlife and wildlife security and ivory trade and that sort of thing. But she's also been the author of a report recently called Measuring What Matters. So we're picking up on the values and sort of that science and values and change interface here. So please come on up.
Hello. Okay, so before I get really into it, I'm going to ask you to do something a little goofy and close your eyes and think about a time when an encounter with an animal made you happy. Okay, you've got some happy looks. You can open your eyes. So maybe you thought about your own cat or dog, or some nods, or seeing wildlife in the wild, or maybe a songbird outside your window, or when you're hiking. Okay, so now, changing gears slightly, how do you think our current economic system supports that happy experience? It probably doesn't. I'm just going to do a little spoiler. So valuing short-term economic activity, which is what GDP measures, right, favors time at work over time with your companion animal. It values development over wild spaces. It values cutting that tree down and selling it as lumber over letting a bird sing in it. So if animals make us happy, but our current system doesn't support that happiness, what can we do? Well, that's what I'm here to talk about, to solve all our problems. So I'm the U.S. Country Director at IFAW, and I've been working for the last 20 years in Washington, trying to basically talk about the value of nature in economic terms. And of course, there's been some really progressive work we've heard about today about expanding that dollar value for ecosystem services and stuff like that. But when we've had some success in saving, islands of wild places from development, but then something comes along like climate change or the current extinction crisis, and you realize this system really is not working. It's not working for people, it's not working for animals, it's really not working for the planet. And for example, we're losing elephants. Everyone knows that we're losing more than one every 30 minutes to ivory poachers. We're losing more every year than are being born. And I believe, and of course it has some impact on GDP to lose elephants, right? I mean, they are drivers for ecotourism, they have an economic value, but most of the value of elephants lies beyond GDP. They contribute to the ecosystem, they disperse seeds, they dig water holes, and other important tangible benefits to animals and people. But they have other values. They have spiritual values, they have cultural values to people, but they also have a value of just being an elephant, right? An intrinsic value. And if we lost them, that would be a lot more than GDP could measure. I think we would probably all agree on that. And I believe that our current system has created at least two conditions, probably more, that are contributing to the potential loss of elephants. The first one is the sales of dead elephant parts count towards GDP, ivory, other things. And the system has also promoted really wide economic inequalities that cause poor people in poorer countries to kill elephants because of desperation, because of illegal wildlife traffickers urging them to do it, which really feeds a market for ivory trinkets in rich countries for people to show off their power, their wealth. And that's just really one example of a system that doesn't support the happiness of people or the well-being of animals or the planet. So, onto the optimistic part. As you may know, in Bhutan, they use a measure called gross national happiness instead of GDP. And they have 9 domains, which are up here for you to look at your leisure while I tell a little story about why I got interested in G&H in the first place. After Hurricane Katrina, for example, Hurricane Katrina increased our GDP, as natural disasters do, as crime does, because it really spurs economic growth. It spurs people to spend money and, buy alarms and reconstruct. But it obviously does terrible things to the environment. It causes terrible suffering, human suffering. And these types of things cause me to think, if we are, if that's positive, if that's increasing our GDP, then we're clearly measuring the wrong things if we're considering that growth good. And that started me along the line of, well, there's something wrong here. And then economic growth is also growing consumption in illegal wildlife trade, climate change, a lot of other stuff. So I saw the Bhutan measure, and I thought, that's something I think worth thinking about. And then at IFA, I thought, could we apply those domains to animals and the threats facing them and maybe completely change the game instead of always working around the edges of a system that's not really working? For example, we make rhino horn illegal, people turn to ivory. We make ivory illegal. There's always another species to exploit if their parts are worth more than their lives. So that's where, I wanted to say, we absolutely should promote growth, no question. But we should define the things that we want to grow as the things that matter to us, not just something that's easy to measure or that we've been measuring or that was designed after World War II to measure whether our factories were back online, which is what GDP does. So that's where this report, which is available at our booth, Measuring What Matters, True Well-Being for Animals and People, came from. So basically, it has 2 parts. The first half is a review of G&H, gross national happiness, and other alternative indicator systems that are going on. It doesn't have a review of the one I just learned about this morning, the China one from the plenary. Very exciting. But there is something in Maryland called the Genuine Progress Index, also in Vermont, and a lot of other things going on around the world. And then the second half, we look at how animals contribute to human well-being using gross national happiness, go back for a second, as a rubric, basically, using peer-reviewed journals to look at, for example, how animals contribute to human psychological well-being or health. So I did that, or we did that, for a couple reasons. I'll quickly go through them. Well, there's just a couple, but wanted to bring a new point of view and attract the animal lovers into this changing indicator discussion, because I think there's a lot of energy there.
but also to ensure that animal welfare and conservation were included in some way in these new indicators. Also, something that's become really important lately is that as we're working for this new world, new world order, we need to keep and improve our policies to protect animal welfare, conservation now, because it helps animals, but it also helps people, and that might be an argument that resonates in some quarters now. So, and also because we're losing these animals as we speak. We're losing elephants, we're losing tigers, you know, there's a sense of urgency that can bring to the conversation, and we don't have a whole lot of time to keep talking about it. So I have two quick case studies that I want to talk about how some of these domains can help with a really holistic view of conservation and animal welfare. The first one is on whale sharks in India. So whale sharks, biggest fish in the world, some as long as 40 feet or a school bus. There had been a small-scale fishery in Gujarat in India for a long time, but by 1999, the shark trade was very, very heavy. They were killing 600 whale sharks a year for the shark fins. One fin could get $57,000 in China, which obviously a lot of money anywhere, but especially in this part of India. And a third of them were juveniles, so it was a really important place to protect. A law was passed in 2001 to protect them in India, but it wasn't really working. So we needed to find a way to connect people to the fish so that they would basically stop fishing it. IFAW and the Wildlife Trust of India started a campaign to appeal to kind of the higher self of the fishermen and the community. So they found the spiritual leader, a spiritual leader in India, joined the campaign, and he told the story of the whale shark being like a daughter coming home to give birth. They had festivals all over the state, and they showed how gentle it was through underwater footage. And people started to feel a little more connected to it. And they held kids' painting contests, fishermen made pledges to protect it, and people really became proud of their role as the birthplace of this shark. And fishermen started setting it free when it was caught in the nets, and it's now a flagship species for the area, and tourists come specifically to see it. Second quick case study is on post-war conflict and dogs in Bosnia. So in 2012, which was 17 years after the war, the UN Development Program did a survey of what people thought was the biggest security risk in their communities, thinking it would be unexploded mines or fear of their neighbors or something. It turned out to be dogs, roaming dogs, packs of roaming dogs. They asked IFAW to come in and help, and IFAW brought the community together through a facilitated process. The community realized the dog problems were human problems, and humans really had to provide what the dogs needed. So they came up with a plan to sterilize the dogs, provide food and water and shelter, and education for the kids. They raised money through grants for a vet clinic. And the most important result was that working together built trust in that community again, which had been sorely lacking after the war. And they built governance institutions that worked for this issue, but being a non-hot-button issue, it also continued to work in the future for other issues. And the people felt safer, healthier, they bonded with the dogs. And the mayor said the project improved the welfare of the dogs, brought happiness to his town again, which is great, and the dogs are better off. So finally, our current global system doesn't value animals or people or the planet over economic growth yet. And we need a system that measures what really matters, not just what's easy to measure. We need to measure and promote the well-being of people and the planet, and it should include measuring and valuing the well-being of animals because, as we can see from the report, what is good for animals is ultimately good for people. And so having a positive solution, working towards this systems change, is really critical to achieve the change that we and the animals that we love, that make us happy, really need. So, thank you very much. Okay, anyone have a question? No questions. Okay, yeah?
Can you give us one example of what kind of information you get on one of the 9 elements of happiness?
Sure. About the animals specifically?
You're not measuring in dollars because that's not what you want to do, but how do you communicate the value of diversity to a decision maker?
Well, so in Bhutan, the only place that this is actually operational is in Bhutan. And I don't think that the Bhutanese system is directly applicable to most other places. I think for the US, I would say something, an interim step before we get to overall happiness would be something like the Genuine Progress Index, which is what they measure in Maryland and Vermont, and 18 other states have looked at it. And it uses data that is already being collected on a federal level. So for example, what they do is they would take your gross state product, so GSP in Maryland, and they have a dollar value associated with that. And then you subtract the cost of crime, of which there is also a dollar value. Depending on the crime, it has a dollar value associated with it. Add the cost, the value of volunteer hours, subtract the cost of converting an acre of wetland, and an acre of farmland, and they have 26 different measures, and you come up with what is the Genuine Progress Index. And it, coincidentally, it more directly tracks with people's happiness measurements when they do happiness polls. And then, so GDP, or the GSP, would be here, and your gross, your Genuine Progress Index is generally a little bit lower than your GDP, which, so I think that's probably going to be something that is really possible to track. These are things like, they don't have a dollar value at all associated with them. They do a 9-hour survey in Bhutan to tell how satisfied people are with that. I think that's not likely to happen here.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right. Our last speaker is Dawn Zimmerman. She's with Smithsonian's Global Health Program. She's actually spent some time in the wild with mountain gorillas. She's both a wildlife and zoo vet, and is going to talk to us a bit about some of her work with the mountain gorillas in Africa. Let's see, I have to get through these, I believe. No, that's okay. There we go. Thank you.
So in 2007, a group of mountain gorillas were killed in the Virunga National Park in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And many of you might have seen this photo and know the story of how charcoal traders shot Senkwekwe, the silverback, 8 times in his back and lit 2 females on fire. 6 of the 10 members of the group were killed, and this was an effort for them to take control of the park. Because if the gorillas weren't there, then the park is theirs to cut down the trees for the charcoal. And what this illustrates is the conflict, the struggle between humans, wildlife, and the environment that the mountain gorilla faces. And what I want to talk about today is that struggle, while seemingly insurmountable, this is a species that has faced like a perfect storm, if you will, of threats. And through a One Health approach, has recovered. And it's an amazing story. And the recovery is said to represent one of the greatest success stories of modern conservation. The mountain gorilla is found in only two regions, and they're isolated for over 1,000 years. Bwindi in Uganda, and the Virunga Massif, which is partly in Rwanda, DR Congo, and Uganda. And of course, in '67, Diane Fossey started an 18-year study on the mountain gorilla. I think by 1981, the nadir was about 250 animals. So this is a critically endangered species. She for sure thought they would be extinct by the end of the century, and she pleaded for a veterinarian to come and basically care for ill, injured, orphaned gorillas. And these are, you know, the habitat was decreasing, the poaching levels were coming up, and what happened was the advent of the Mountain Gorilla Veterinary Project. This is now called Gorilla Doctors. It's managed by UC Davis. And what started with the program was basic veterinary care, and over the years it developed into using a One Health approach to kind of link, again, the struggle between humans, wildlife, and the environment. And this is not any news to anybody, but on a basic level, One Health is the interrelationship between human health, animal health, and the environment. So with environmental health, if you will, this mountain gorilla might be looking over what used to be his home. The parks, particularly in the Virunga Massif, have lost probably over 40 to 50% since like the 1950s. And there is no buffer zone between agriculture and forest. So this creates, again, that interface and that struggle between humans, wildlife, and the environment. And so you don't have to hear me talk so much. On the environmental threat level, this is really best depicted in a trailer that Orlando gave me permission to use. Do you have a sound?
Le parc national de Virunga contribue au développement de notre pays.
A region famous for its endangered mountain gorillas.
C'est ça ma vie. Ils ont l'amour. Notre vie en dépend beaucoup.
We think that we have a problem.
A British company is exploring for oil.
My work is to manage the park to ensure that it's protected. Any oil-related activities are illegal.
All the armed groups will want their slice of the cake. I think they're playing with fire.
It's the money that fuels everything. Blame God.
This isn't a war yet, but it could be soon.
Ça va barder ici. The danger is near us.
The Congolese army is fleeing.
M23, ils sont là.
Fear has driven people out of these villages into farmland.
If we were to leave, we would lose everything.
The park itself is the only hope this region has. It's intense.
You must justify why you are on this earth.
Finalement, nous serons aussi jugés. Nous allons seulement croiser le bras quand le parc sera en train de disparaître.
Pourtant, notre souhait est que ce parc reste immortel.
So this documentary was filmed over the 2 years that I was working in DR Congo with the mountain gorillas. And it's very realistic depiction of what was dealt with in that region. And of course, the political and economic things are not something a veterinarian conservationist can really deal with. But what we can do is try to understand that struggle and approach it from all three sides. The basis of the conflict in DRC is, of course, resource acquisition. And so as an environmental threat, that is very much linked to the gorilla health. The armed conflict, a lot of what you see here, this was a M23 rebels. And it was, there's what you may see in the movie, if you see the documentary, is that there were only 4 mountain gorillas in captivity in the world. And they were at that room in Gabo that was bombed. So it's very kind of emotional for me being there at that time, where there was a 4-hour ceasefire that was negotiated with the rebels for me to come up and move those gorillas. It's just an unrealistic story, and yet these gorillas have recovered, and it's a huge, huge success. So that civil war has resulted in the death of over 6 million people in DRC, and that's been characterized as the biggest cause of human suffering since World War II. And so like the ways that Gorilla Doctors has tried to approach it is to address threats on those 3 levels: environmental health, animal health, and human health. Environmental health, there are different ways, as you heard in some of the other talks, is that you can provide job opportunities through guerrilla tourism. Jobs are offered as porters and rangers, and we also did a eco briquette program, which also decreases pressure on the park. And animal health, you can see there's no buffer zone between the agricultural land and the park, and so you're seeing gorillas coming out of the park, particularly to eat eucalyptus. You're seeing domestic animals and people going into the park, again, for resources. And there are parasites that we've documented that are in both humans, cattle, and gorillas. So this is kind of an interface, which is kind of a perfect way that infectious diseases might be introduced into the animal population here, talking about gorillas. And then on top of that, it's a huge tourism industry. And this is very successful for these 3 countries. And it's also then successful for the gorillas. But it also creates an interaction. There is an 8-meter rule with tourists, but the gorillas don't know that. They'll come right and sit in your lap. And so there is that potential for disease infection. And a common cold virus, metapneuma virus, has infected and killed gorillas. There has been a measles outbreak. These are fairly thought to be directly linked to tourism. And if you take trauma, specifically conspecific trauma, out of the equation, the lead cause of death in mountain gorillas is respiratory disease. And that is a very, very real possibility that's coming from tourists. And so the solution there is, how can we monitor? This is kind of extreme conservation, that this species has veterinarians in all 3 countries there 24/7 to monitor and treat these gorillas. This is Dr. Eddie. He's a head Congolese vet, and he'll go out. We visit every group in every country, every habituated group, once a month at least. And he'll know every individual by their nose print, and he'll write down every single vital sign he can possibly get. And here he's taking the GPS location, and it's my favorite joke. Then the gorillas take his GPS location. So you can see how curious they are. You can't help but not love them. And this is the reason that we're able to create such extreme conservation. The tourism really is what's keeping this animal survival. So these are examples of interventions. The Gorilla Doctor team only intervenes when it's a life-threatening or human-induced injury. And then in terms of human health, this land right around the park edge is where the poorest people live, where the densest population is, up to 500 people per square kilometer. It's often, again, associated with poverty, highest HIV infection rates, lowest hygiene. These are 95% of these are people living here are subsistence farmers. They're making an average of $1 a day. So like the other talks, how can you judge how they're making their living, and what can you do to help negate, that struggle between human, wildlife, and environment? What can you do to release that pressure? And then also this is not a very good dense photo, but there are a lot of people just walking into the park that are right on that edge. And this is the poverty, the high human population density, the lack of hygiene, the landscape use that you're seeing, the change that you're seeing. This is kind of a perfect storm for emerging infectious diseases like Ebola, SARS, HIV. And so what Gorilla Doctors also participates in is a USAID program called PREDICT. And they look at finding novel infectious diseases at that interface between humans, wildlife, and livestock. In addition, Gorilla Doctors implemented an employee health program, and just from a 1-year period, so every ranger, porter, everyone who has contact with gorillas that goes into the forest is screened and treated if necessary. And also they do it like a mitigation of behavioral activities in the forest. And you can see just in 1 year that 13% of people that had no diseases went to 41% just 1 year of this program. And then, of course, community outreach and education is an important part of the project, and it's a way to convey the One Health message. And then the result of the efforts in combination with other partners, the mountain gorilla population over 7 years from 2003 to 2010 increased 26.3%, and they're increasing still. There's a difference between unhabituated and habituated gorilla. Obviously, habituated you can't approach. The unhabituated gorillas were found to decline despite intense conservation, conventional conservation, about 0.7% over a 40-year period, while those that we could access for veterinary care, this extreme conservation, increased 4.1%. And that difference, up to 40% of that difference was attributed to this veterinary care. And this isn't just gonna help the mountain gorillas. This is the golden monkeys, the servals, buffalo, elephant, all these animals in the forest will reap those benefits. And again, it's just, there's these huge scales, particularly in these countries. It's amazing what Rwanda has come back from in '94 and DRC with this war that's ongoing, and to have this merging, if you will, this understanding, having 3 countries come together to save a species, it's pretty amazing what they've done considering the circumstances. And our goal is really just to have, very similar to your slide, have these happy, healthy gorillas next to happy, healthy children. And just basically that a One Health approach could prove to be the thin line between extinction and survival. Thanks.
We're a tad over, but let me just see if there's a question for Dawn.
How do you feel about us going to see them? It's a good idea or bad idea?
Yeah, the question is how do we feel about tourism? I think it's a good question. Diane Fossey was so against tourism, and it is one of those things with extreme conservation that if you're taking advantage of gorillas being habituated so that you could approach them, so that you can treat them. The thing is the tourism is already there. It's giving so much GDP to the country. It's 10% of Rwanda's. Each gorilla per year in Uganda is about giving $1 million, coming in with $1 million. It's no one's going to Rwanda except for gorillas, I don't think. So it's definitely it's a double-edged sword, if you will. So I mean, we do the best with the circumstances we're presented with. So obviously we'd like to see the gorillas living without this kind of contact, but in the world we live in now, we have to figure out a way to coexist and sustainably. You good?
All right, so I hate to say goodbye, because it was really, thank you all to the panelists for amazing talks. Really very, very terrific. I hope we've left you all with some inspiration about that there is hope, that there is actually some serious problems, and that yet there are still solutions with our ability to be creative and innovate, that you will go forward from this session throughout the rest of the meeting and throughout the rest of your life, actually, and figure out what you can do differently in your own life and in your own institution, and how we should be thinking differently as a society to change some of these systems that are actually not really working for us so much anymore. So thank you very much for coming and participating. Thank you to the panelists, and have a great rest of the day.